Welcome back to Face the Nation. For a closer look at what Americans are thinking about the war in Ukraine, we go to CBS News Elections and Surveys Director Anthony Salvanto. Good morning to you, Anthony.
Good morning, Margaret.
You know, some of the biggest news of the week was the Biden administration's decision finally to put a block on imports of Russian petroleum products into the United States. So they admit it is going to make things more expensive for consumers. What did Americans think about that?
Margaret, there is wide support for oil sanctions against Russia, and something we don't get to say every day, it is bipartisan. In fact, really strong with both Democrats and Republicans. But importantly, in a poll you want to follow up and ask people then, what if that means you're going to pay more at the pump? And when you do that, majority support remains at 63%. Now, this is something we'll have to watch. It might depend on just how much those prices rise, but you ask people why it is that they support the sanctions, and it's not that they say they can readily afford it. It's that they say they want to help Ukraine and punish Russia. Margaret?
But inflation is already at a new 40-year high. So just how tolerant are people going to be?
Well, what happens is people feel like Russia is not going to stop at Ukraine. There's 69% who think that Russia is going to invade other countries. And they're concerned about a wider war. They're concerned about a global recession. And when you look at the folks who are most concerned about that, they're even more likely to support the oil sanctions. So you read this sense that people might be willing to pay more now in order to try to stop or avoid something worse later, Margaret.
Anthony, how do Americans assess the president's leadership during this crisis?
Well, his handling of it is up over the last week, but it's still not net positive. A couple of reasons for that. One is people say they still feel nervous about this. And secondly, there's half the country that says they want him to take stronger action towards Russia. So we followed up and we asked, well, what would be stronger action? And the things that pop out are even stronger sanctions and supplying more military weapons to Ukraine. We also looked at the idea of enforcing a no-fly zone. And here you see Americans' real wariness about getting into a wider war. Because in the abstract, you get a majority that says, yes, they'd support a no-fly zone. But then you follow up and ask, well, what if Russia takes that as an act of war? What if that leads to a direct U.S.-Russia conflict? And then support really drops off down to 38%. So you see Americans wanting to do something, wanting to stop Russia, but really concerned about being drawn in to a conflict. Margaret.
Anthony Salvanto, thank you. We'll be right back. Last week, harsh financial sanctions and trade restrictions were put in place to punish Russia and cripple its economy. Among them, the banning of all Russian imports of oil, gas, and coal, as well as goods like vodka and caviar. Joining us now is the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva. Welcome to Face the Nation.
Thank you very much for having me.
I wonder how you can calculate the total impact of all of these restrictions that have been put on Russia. I mean, will Russia default on its debts, and what impact will that have to the global economy?
Let's remember that the reason they are unprecedented sanctions is because the unthinkable happened. A devastating war in Ukraine. And the impact of the sanctions is quite severe for the Russian economy. We expect deep recession in Russia, and this abrupt contraction is affecting already how the Russian population is taking the hit on them. The ruble depreciated significantly. What does it mean? Real incomes have shrunk. Purchasing power of the Russian population has significantly diminished. Mm-hmm. In terms of servicing debt obligations, I can say that no longer we think of Russian default as improbable event. Russia has the money to service its debt, but cannot access it. What I'm more concerned is that there are consequences that go beyond Ukraine
Right.
and Russia.
Right. I mean, you have said that the crisis in Ukraine could cause famine in Africa, for example. You look at the wheat imports and the price spikes there. Which countries around the world are you most concerned about? Is this going to destabilize other governments?
What we are mostly concerned about are the immediate neighbors of Russia and Ukraine, the Central Asian republics, the Caucasus, Moldova, because they have trade relations with both Russia and Ukraine, more than the rest of the world, and because of this outflow of people, refugee wave in Europe that is of the order of magnitude of what happened in the Second World War. So there, the impact is most significant. Beyond the immediate neighbors, there are two groups of countries we are very worried. The first group are countries that have yet to recover from the COVID-induced economic crisis. For them, this shock is particularly painful. And the second group of countries are those that are more dependent on energy imports from Russia, because there the impact on consumption, but also on inflation, is going to be more prominent.
Are we looking, because of the debt levels you talk about, the vulnerability, are we looking at the potential of this becoming a financial crisis for the rest of the world?
For now, no. When we look at the total exposure of banks to Russia, it is about $120 billion. Not negligent, but definitely not systemically relevant. And what we are also seeing is that while inevitably we are going to downgrade our growth projections for 2022, it is still going to be a positive growth rate. For countries that have been fast to recover from the COVID crisis, like the United States, growth is robust. It is those that were falling behind where the impact is more severe. And let me say this. Yes, war in Ukraine means hunger in Africa. But war in Ukraine also has social implications for many, many countries through the three channels that are already demonstrably impactful. One, commodity prices, energy, grains, fertilizers, metals. Two, the impact that has on inflation. And in countries where inflation has already been high, this is dramatic.
Like the United States.
Like the United States, like many emerging market countries, think of Brazil, Mexico. And three, what do we do when we have to fight inflation? We tighten financial conditions.
I have a question for you. You've been working on emergency funding for Ukraine. If that government falls, can Russia seize that money? If Russia installs a puppet government in Ukraine, can they get access to that money?
We are thinking of our interactions with Ukraine as being very productive. We have provided $1.4 billion in emergency financing into the Ukrainian special account with the IMF. In other words, it is being drawn by the government of Ukraine, and nobody else can touch it. And we see that the Ukrainian authorities have been remarkable. Margaret, we had negotiations on this $1.4 billion, and my staff tells me they can hear the air raids, sirens, and yet works go on. I have family in Ukraine. They tell me they can still pull money from bankomats, even in the city of Kharkiv, that is the second largest heavily bombarded city. So bravo to the Ukrainian authorities for what they do.
Director, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you.
And we'll be tracking that ongoing story. We want to go now to the Chief Economic Advisor to Allianz, and that's Mohamed El-Erian, who joins us this morning from Cambridge, England. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Margaret.
In this country, we saw yet another high, a 40-year high in inflation. It's the Fed's job to control that, and the Fed chief has some big decisions this week. What are you expecting?
Well, he doesn't have an easy decision. As you said, inflation is high and will go higher because of what's happening in Ukraine. And basically, he's got to make a choice: hit the brakes, regain credibility, but risk a recession, or tap the brakes, and we have an inflation problem going into next year. We are here because the Fed is very late and has no good policy options available anymore.
No good policy options. You're expecting what kind of rate hike, and what is the risk of recession at this point? Goldman Sachs, I know, up their forecast to at least a 20% chance of a recession in the United States.
Yes, and they are thinking that we're going to get 7 hikes this year. I don't think we will get 7 hikes. I don't think this economy can support 7 hikes. And if we do get 7 hikes, we will go into recession. That's the cost of being late. I suspect that what we'll hear on Wednesday, Margaret, is a 25 basis point rate hike. We will hear that more are on the way, and we will hear that they will also contract what has become a 9 trillion balance sheet. We are in this absurd situation that last week, when we got the 7.9% inflation print, the Fed was still putting liquidity into this economy. That just gives you a feel for how misaligned policy has been.
Well, Mohamed, you've been a critic for some time. The White House this week is calling inflation a Putin price hike. But you were on this program back in December talking about how serious inflation was. Where does the responsibility for this lie exactly?
So it lies in the circumstances. It lies in the Fed being late and mischaracterizing inflation. Till the end of November, they were calling it transitory. But also, to be fair to the administration, there will be a Putin inflation component. I estimate that at 7.9%, we will probably get very close or above 10% before we come down. And that difference will be all because of the disruption that Putin's war imply for commodity prices, supply chains, and shipments.
Double-digit inflation. When do you think we will see that? I mean, people are really feeling it now.
Yeah, if it happens, it will happen in the summer, and people will feel it. The worst thing for us would be not only do we feel the higher inflation, but we also feel income losses. That's why it's critical to avoid a recession. We can't avoid stagflation, lower growth, higher prices, but we certainly can avoid a recession, and we can bounce back quickly.
As we said, I mean, it is the Fed's job to control inflation. The White House is saying both that it is not their fault, but that they're doing something about it at the same time. Are there political measures here that actually can be taken?
There are, and they're stuck in Congress. You can do more to increase labor force participation so that wage pressure comes down. That's about childcare. That's about easing people's way back into the labor force. You can do more to enhance productivity, and you can do more to remove supply bottlenecks. The administration has policies. Lots of them are stuck in Congress right now.
When you talk about supply chain bottlenecks, we have to remember we are coming out of this global pandemic, and just overnight we're seeing headlines that local authorities in Shenzhen, China have imposed a new lockdown there due to a COVID outbreak. This is a major manufacturing hub for the rest of the world. I don't want to overstate this, but how concerned should we be about this as a factor?
We should, because China is sticking to its zero COVID policy at a time when Omicron makes that policy very hard to implement. So they will have sequential lockdowns that will have spillovers to us. We can be a good house, but we're living right now in a really tough neighborhood. And that's why it's really important to respond quickly. We can't fall behind again on policies.
Again on policies, okay. So that's up to the Fed. But when we look ahead for the year, the Treasury Secretary is already saying we should expect 12 months of inflation. When can we play catch up there and bring prices back down? Or are these tools really out of the hands of policymakers at this point?
So So Secretary Yellen is correct. We unfortunately are going to have at least 12 months of uncomfortable inflation, something that we haven't had since the 70s and 80s. And that's going to be especially problematic for the more vulnerable segments of our society. It hits food and gas particularly hard. As to what we can do, we have to be really careful that we don't get another wave of inflation due to what economists call de-anchored inflation expectations. Basically, Margaret, it's a simple story. Right now, I will go in, I being the American worker, and ask for compensation for past inflation. If I don't have faith in my policymakers, I will also ask for compensation for future inflation. I want to protect myself preemptively. Right. If that happens, then we have that awful wage price cycle.
Mohamed El-Erian, thank you very much for your analysis this morning, and we will track what happens in the coming days. We will be back in a moment. Today marks 2 years since the start of a national emergency in the U.S. due to COVID-19. Earlier, we spoke with the chairman and CEO of Pfizer, Albert Bourla, about his book, Moonshot, inside Pfizer's 9-month race to make the impossible possible. Here's part of our conversation. Do you think that we will every fall have to prepare ourselves for a booster shot with COVID just like we get a flu shot?
I think so. Many variants are coming, and Omicron was the first one that was able to evade in a skillful way the immune protection that we were giving. But also we know that the duration of the protection doesn't last very long. So what we are trying to do, and we are working very diligently right now, it is to make not only a vaccine that will protect against all variants, including Omicron, but also something that can protect for at least a year.
So you've seen some of that data on a fourth dose, a second booster shot. You think it will be necessary? It
is necessary, a fourth boost right now. The protection that you are getting from the third, it is good enough, actually quite good for hospitalizations and deaths. It's not that good against infections, but doesn't last very long. But we are just submitting those data to the FDA, and then we will see what the experts also will say outside Pfizer. So the question that was number one on my list, and I think for so many parents, is when will the vaccine be available for those children 5 and under? Potentially May, if it works. FDA, I'm sure, will do their utmost to review them fast. And we will be ready with manufacturing. You are a global corporation. How is the instability in Europe right now regarding Russia and Ukraine impacting you? Do you expect supply chain issues or pricing effects from this? No, I don't think that we will have. We are very independent in terms of our supplying our ingredients from those parts of the world. We are not making over there medicines. We do make some medicines in Russia for Russia, but we do not export. We do not expect to see in the world any disruptions right now, at least, because of this war. You don't plan then to divest from Russia? Every time that you have bans or, let's say, trade restrictions, typically they don't apply to medicines because these are about lives. How can you say I'm not going to send to the cancer medicines to Russians because of what they did? Usually they are exempt from these, let's say, situations, but clearly we don't plan to invest in Russia. And we have very little investments there, frankly. What do you think with the technology that Pfizer used and Moderna, mRNA technology? It's still new, and it seems like there are a lot of possibilities for where this could be used. What's the next solution around the corner? I would say that the lowest hanging fruit is other vaccines, how to use this technology to bring vaccines that we don't have right now, or we have and they are not good enough. Flu is a good example. The flu vaccines are not very good in general. And there are other diseases that we don't have good vaccines. So that will be, I think, the first. The second is oncology, cancer. Right now, a lot of research is happening by trying to use to train our immune system through mRNA, not to attack the virus, as we do with coronavirus, but to attack our cancer cells, to recognize them as an enemy and try to attack them. That will revolutionize the field if we will be able to be successful with that. How far are you from that? You know, I think there's so much work happening even before the vaccines. We started with cancer in RNA. We will know if we are successful, I think, in the next 2-3 years. Our full conversation's available on our website and our YouTube channel. We'll be right back.
Around the world, the moral outrage at the scenes and reports from Ukraine are deafening. But that outrage has not dented Vladimir Putin's resolve. Among the many atrocities last week, Russia bombed a maternity hospital. As pregnant women tried to bring life into the world, some lost theirs. Others defied the odds. Standing next to the American vice president, Poland's leader said a line has been crossed, calling the attack an act of barbarity with the features of a genocide. Vladimir Putin has shown time and again that he does not believe rules apply to him. The U.S. now says he's considering using chemical weapons.
Russia would pay a severe price if they use chemical weapons.
But what is that consequence that could stop Putin? President Biden has drawn a bright line to say the U.S. will not use military force to stop Russia from killing Ukrainians. Is there a level of catastrophe that might change his mind? Vladimir Putin has terrified European leaders who admit their past complacency may have emboldened him. Britain's top diplomat.
The invasion of Ukraine is a paradigm shift on the scale of 9/11. The era of complacency is over.
That new reality convinced Germany, a country that had disavowed the militant legacy of World War II, to send weapons to the war zone. But that makes little difference to the 2.5 million Ukrainians who fled their homes in the past 2 weeks, and the more than 40 million still there. As Ukrainians defy the odds on the battlefield, Russia is estimated to have lost more soldiers in 2 weeks than the U.S. did in 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, Western leaders say they want Russian mothers to stop Putin. Perhaps by losing more of their own sons, they'll protest, realizing that they no longer have anything else left to lose. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.